Imagine a single battle that changes, well, pretty much everything. Not just the destiny of a nation, but literally the future of the literature you read and the exact language you're hearing me speak right now. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're traveling back nearly 1,000 years to uncover an absolutely fascinating story. It's a massive web of politics, warfare, and some crazy cultural transformation. So, picture this. The year is 1066. It's a massive milestone in human history that marked a completely violent collision of cultures, the Norman Conquest. And that brings us to the real mystery we're unraveling today. How in the world did one bloody battle in 1066 invent the English we speak today? I mean, it sounds like a massive stretch, right? How exactly does a medieval military clash dictate our modern vocabulary? Well, the truth is, this conquest didn't just change who sat on a throne. It completely transformed the country's politics, its society, its culture, and most permanently, its language. It forced an absolute end to the Old English period and birthed an entirely new literary age. Here's a quick roadmap for this explainer. 1. The Anglo-Saxon status quo. 2. The succession crisis. 3. The Battle of Hastings. 4. William's new feudal order. And 5. The linguistic fusion. Let's jump right into section 1, the Anglo-Saxon status quo before the 1066 invasion. You see, before 1066, this world was deeply entrenched. England had been ruled by the Anglo-Saxons for more than 600 years, and Old English was absolutely the dominant language. The society was, deeply agrarian. Most folks were farmers living in small, quiet villages, with their daily lives revolving around monasteries and the Christian church. But it was also a society ruled by tough kings and warriors. You can see this perfectly reflected in their heroic literature, like the famous epic poem Beowulf. Basically, it was a really stable kingdom, but right beneath the surface, a huge amount of political uncertainty was brewing. Which brings us to section 2, the succession crisis. A king without an heir. This right here is the main catalyst, the very first domino to fall. In January of 1066, King Edward the Confessor dies. But the critical, absolutely crucial detail here is that he dies without leaving an heir to the throne. And, as you might guess in medieval Europe, a king dying without a clear successor is essentially a guaranteed recipe for immediate disaster. Because of Edward's death, several powerful men immediately threw their hats in the ring for the English throne. On one side, you've got Harold Godwinson, England's most powerful nobleman, someone deeply rooted in the Anglo-Saxon power structure. On the other side, looking across the English Channel, you have William, the Duke of Normandy. Now, William claimed that Edward had actually promised the throne directly to him previously. Oh, and just to make things even more chaotic, a third guy, Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, also decided destiny was on his side and claimed the crown for himself. Each of these men prepared a massive army. Just like that, England was standing on the absolute brink of an explosive civil war. Moving to section 3, the Battle of Hastings, October 14, 1066. This is some incredibly fast-paced history we're talking about. In January, Edward dies. By October, massive armies clash at Hastings. And by December, William is wearing the crown. It's just a rapid, total collapse of Anglo-Saxon rule in less than 12 months. Boom, boom, boom. So these two powerful armies meet near Hastings with wildly different tactical approaches. Harold's Anglo-Saxon soldiers relied heavily on traditional, static shield walls. They literally locked their heavy shields together to form this impenetrable, solid barrier. On the flip side, William's Norman army brought highly skilled cavalry, versatile infantry, and incredibly deadly archers. For several hours, the battle was completely up in the air. The English shield wall was actually holding strong. But then, disaster strikes for the English. According to historical tradition, Harold is struck right in the eye by an arrow and killed in the absolute chaos of combat. This is the ultimate turning point. With their kings suddenly dead, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall finally breaks and the defenses just totally crumble. The Norman army capitalizes on the chaos and achieves a decisive, incredibly bloody victory. From that day forward, the Duke of Normandy would be known to history as William the Conqueror. So the really crucial takeaway here is this. William's victory ended Anglo-Saxon rule forever. There was no treaty. There was no going back. That 600-year era of Anglo-Saxon dominance was completely, permanently wiped out on that battlefield. Section 4. William's new feudal order. Norman rule begins. On Christmas Day, 1066, William is crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. But he didn't just politely take the throne, he systematically dismantled the entire Old World. Step 1, he replaces nearly all the Anglo-Saxon leaders with his own French-speaking Norman nobles. Step 2, to heavily enforce this new rule, massive stone castles are built all across England, literally acting as these huge physical symbols of Norman dominance over the agrarian landscape. Step 3, a strict new feudal system completely reorganizes society from top to bottom. Basically, England mutated overnight into a strictly divided, multilingual kingdom. At the very top, in the royal court, everyone speaks Norman French. Over in the church and among the scholars, the language is entirely Latin. But down at the bottom, the ordinary people, the farmers and villagers we talked about, they are still speaking Old English. So you end up with 3 entirely different languages coexisting in one single country, sharply divided by class and power. And finally, Section 5, the linguistic fusion, the birth of Middle English. For centuries following the conquest, English, French, and Latin lived side by side, basically rubbing shoulders every single day. And what happens when languages exist in the exact same space for that long? They bleed into one another. Thousands of French loanwords poured into the English language, specifically into high-status domains like governments, law, the military, arts, and even fashion and food. Because these areas were completely controlled by the French-speaking elite, their vocabulary totally took over. In fact, many of the very words I'm using to explain this to you right now are a direct result of this exact cultural collision. But listen, it wasn't just a simple matter of adding some fancy new words to the dictionary. The actual underlying machinery of the language was altered. As English people tried desperately to communicate with French speakers and vice versa, the really complex, cumbersome grammar of Old English became stripped down and incredibly simplified. Many of those super tricky Old English word endings, they just simply disappeared completely over time. The whole language became much more streamlined. Ultimately, a totally new language gradually emerged from this centuries-long melting pot. Historians officially define this as Middle English. It's basically the vital bridge between the ancient, heroic words of Beowulf and the modern English that we speak today. It's the exact language of later great writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, and it was born directly from the trauma and complete reorganization of the Norman Conquest. Simply put, without William the Conqueror, the English language as you and I know it, well, it might never have existed at all. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating question to ponder as we wrap up. If the Normans basically took over everything, the government, the massive castles, all the wealth, and they forced French onto the English court, how on earth did the gritty peasant language of English manage to survive at all, let alone eventually rise up to completely conquer the globe? The story of English is a story of absolutely incredible resilience, and the Norman Conquest was really just the beginning of that remarkable chapter. Think about that the next time you speak a sentence. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a moment in history that literally rewired an entire nation. So, picture this. The year is 1066. The dust has settled on the Battle of Hastings, and William the Conqueror has just seized the English crown. But, here's the truly fascinating part. William quickly realized that winning a kingdom on a battlefield, well, that was just step 1. The actual, real challenge was going to be completely transforming it. Over the next century, his Norman forces would totally reshape the government, the society, the architecture, and honestly, even the very words coming out of people's mouths. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap of how Norman rule sent a massive ripple effect across England's entire identity. We'll be hitting 6 key areas today: the initial impact, structuring the kingdom, physical dominance, the social and spiritual order, the linguistic collision, and finally, documenting the conquest. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the initial impact, securing the kingdom. Right off the bat, stepping off that battlefield in 1066, William faced a colossal problem. How do you actually hold on to all this newly conquered land? Because, as you might guess, Anglo-Saxon rebellions started breaking out across the country immediately. But as we move into the 1070s, William didn't mess around. He responded swiftly, and he responded firmly. He completely gutted the existing power structure, basically replacing defiant local leaders with a brand new class of totally loyal Norman lords. Literally overnight, England was no longer governed by the people who had lived there for centuries. Section 2, structuring the kingdom, a new ruling class. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they actually pulled this off. I mean, once you hand out conquered land to loyal followers, you absolutely need a rigorous system to control them, right? Enter the feudal system. By definition, this was a super strict social contract, where absolutely all land belonged exclusively to the king. He'd exchange pieces of this land downward, but only in return for military service, unwavering loyalty, and a whole lot of heavy labor. It became the ultimate tool for total control. Think of it like a giant, unbreakable social pyramid. Up at the very top, you got the king. Step down a level, and the king grants land to powerful nobles and barons. Step down again, and those nobles reward loyal knights who provide the essential military muscle. And finally, all the way at the bottom, the peasants, or serfs. They work the land just for a simple place to live and military protection. Everyone was totally locked into their specific role, with heavily structured duties and responsibilities. Section 3. Physical Dominance. Norman Castles. So that brings us to a really practical problem. How exactly do you enforce this massive feudal pyramid on a completely hostile population? Well, you use architecture. The Normans started building these massive fortifications called motte and bailey castles. They'd often throw them up in just a matter of weeks. Built on these huge mounds of earth with an enclosed courtyard, they had 3 very clear jobs: protect the new rulers, control the local populations, and basically just project sheer, undeniable power. They were the terrifying physical embodiment of Norman dominance. And over time, those imposing wooden forts evolved into magnificent, impenetrable stone structures. The most famous example, which is actually still standing today, is the Tower of London. It was this massive monument of stone specifically designed to awe, intimidate, and permanently stamp Norman authority right into the English landscape. Section 4. Social and Spiritual Order. Everyday medieval life. Now, while those nobles were busy building giant stone fortresses, the vast majority of the population, the peasants, were working exhausting hours just to survive, and they had absolutely zero formal education. But in the midst of that incredibly grueling existence, the medieval church stepped in as the ultimate guiding force. Right alongside the Norman crown, the church dictated the entire rhythm of the year, provided spiritual direction, and honestly, commanded immense wealth and absolute power over everyday life. Yet even amidst this really harsh, heavily taxed feudal life, the church served a totally vital intellectual role. Monasteries essentially became these isolated engines of learning. You had monks dedicating their entire lives to preserving knowledge, painstakingly copying fragile manuscripts by hand, and educating future scholars. They were literally the keepers of history during an incredibly turbulent age. Section 5. The Linguistic Collision. A Divided Nation. Okay, moving beyond the castles and kings, this is perhaps the greatest lasting ripple effect of the entire conquest: the absolute transformation of the spoken word. Just imagine living in a country where the rulers literally cannot speak to the people they're ruling over. That was England. The elite rulers and officials spoke Norman French, and the church used Latin. Meanwhile, millions of everyday commoners were still speaking Old English. So suddenly you have a nation operating in 3 entirely different languages. And because the Normans completely controlled the top tiers of society, this massive volume of French vocabulary permanently flooded into the English dictionary. We're talking government, justice, military, fashion, food, art, architecture. If a word dealt with power or high culture, it likely came straight from French. It even applied to what people ate. The Anglo-Saxon peasants raised the cows and pigs, but the French elites ate the beef and pork. So, the crucial point here is that Old English plus Norman French equaled Middle English. The collision of that raw, Germanic English spoken by the peasants with the elegant, administrative French of the conquerors birthed a completely blended language. Without the Normans, the modern English we speak today would sound completely alien to us. They fundamentally rewired our dictionaries. Section 6. Documenting the Conquest. The Doomsday Book. Fast forward to 1086, and William wanted a definitive way to cement his total systemic overhaul. He basically needed to know exactly what he owned, so he ordered the creation of the Doomsday Book. This was a massive, unprecedented survey where agents fanned out across the entire kingdom to record every single piece of land, every village, literally down to the very last pig and cow. This incredibly meticulous record allowed William to govern and tax his new kingdom with ultimate efficiency, leaving behind an absolutely legendary historical record. When we take a step back and look at the scope of this entire explainer, it becomes incredibly clear that 1066 was much, much more than just a military victory. The events following the Battle of Hastings laid the absolute foundation for medieval England's government, society, and culture. The Normans built a brand new government, engineered a rigid society through feudalism, erected towering stone monuments, and completely altered the cultural and linguistic DNA of the nation. And that cultural DNA brings us to a pretty fascinating cliffhanger. Because this new blended Middle English wasn't just a tool for administration or farming, it became the vehicle for entirely new forms of expression. So how did this incredible new language, forged from conquest and collision, go on to create the greatest stories and the most legendary literary movement of the Middle Ages? Well, that is a provocative question that will absolutely change how you look at literature forever. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring this amazing era of history.
Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Okay, think about the English language for a second. We so often treat it like this static tool, right? Just a fixed set of rules we had to memorize back in school. But the truth? Language is a living, breathing organism. It grows, it borrows, it adapts. Mostly, it evolves just to survive the changing times. The English that you and I are speaking right now is the result of over 1,000 years of continuous, messy transformation. And today, we're going to zero in on the single most dramatic turning point in that entire 1,000-year history.
So let's dive right into this, because it is absolutely fascinating. Every single time you open your mouth to speak, or, fire off a quick text message, you are literally echoing the aftermath of a massive medieval war. Yep, we are talking about the Norman Conquest of 1066. This wasn't just some routine change in leadership. It was a cultural and linguistic earthquake that permanently altered the entire trajectory of human communication. How exactly did an invasion from almost a millennium ago decide the very vocabulary we're using in this exact moment?
To answer that, we're going to break this massive historical shift down into 5 bite-sized pieces. We'll start with the spark of 1066, move into the vocabulary explosion, see how grammar gets simpler, map out the map of dialects, and finally, cross the bridge to modern English. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the spark of 1066, a linguistic collision. Just to anchor exactly where we are in history, let's look at the timeline. Before 1066, the people of England spoke Old English. If you were to look at an Old English manuscript today, something like Beowulf, it would honestly look completely foreign to you. It was this highly complex ancient language. But then, boom, right there at 1066 we hit the Norman Conquest, and this triggers what we call the Middle English period, running from roughly 1100 to 1500. This 400-year window, it's the crucible. It's the chemical reaction where Old English fundamentally transforms before eventually giving way to the modern English period post-1500.
What's really fascinating here is the social breakdown on the ground. Suddenly, in post-1066 England, you didn't just have one language floating around. You had 3 completely distinct languages forced to coexist in a single land. The ordinary people, which was the vast majority of the population, kept right on speaking Old English. But the new ruling class, the Norman nobles who had just conquered the country, they spoke Norman French. Meanwhile, the church and the scholars, the folks holding the keys to education, continued using Latin. So England basically becomes the ultimate linguistic melting pot. Over time, these 3 separate languages just began to crash into one another, interacting and blending in ways nobody could have predicted.
Which brings us right to Section 2, the vocabulary explosion. New words enter English.
So, when you force ordinary English speakers, French-speaking rulers, and Latin-writing monks into the exact same society, the immediate aftermath is just an absolute explosion of new words. And this brilliantly illustrates how the Norman rulers introduced thousands of French terms, specifically in areas where they held power. In government, they brought us words like crown and parliament. In law, everyday words like justice, judge, and crime, all imported from the French. Same goes for the military, with army and soldier, and even high society concepts like beauty and dress. But my absolute favorite example has to be the food category. See, while the ordinary English peasants were out in the mud raising cows, sheep, and pigs, the French-speaking nobles were eating them at fancy banquets, and that cultural divide gave us the culinary words beef, mutton, and pork. These high-status French words just flooded everyday English, giving the language this incredible new level of flexibility.
But wait, we can't forget about that third language. While French was bringing us the vocabulary of power and high fashion, Latin was quietly supplying all the necessary intellectual and academic vocabulary. Because Latin was still the official language of religion and scholarship, it filtered down into English through monasteries and early universities. Words that form the absolute bedrock of our learning today. Think school, library, education, scripture, and medicine. They all entered the English language directly through this enduring Latin legacy.
Moving right along to Section 3, Simpler Grammar. Shedding old rules.
Now that we've got all these fantastic new words, how on earth do we string them together? Well, in Old English, grammar was incredibly clunky and complicated. It relied on a ton of different word endings to tell you if a word was a subject, an object, singular, plural, you name it. But during this Middle English period, those confusing grammatical endings just slowly disappeared. They shed that ancient grammatical skin. And without those endings, strict word order took over. English started relying heavily on the actual structure and order of the sentence to express meaning, which is a massive hallmark of the English we speak today. But here's the funny part. While the grammar was streamlining, spelling went in the exact opposite direction. Since there was no official dictionary or standard form of English yet, scribes across different regions just spelled words however they sounded to them. It really reflects just how wild and dynamic this evolving language was at the time.
This natural regional variation brings us perfectly to Section 4, the map of dialects, regional voices. It's really crucial to understand that Middle English was absolutely not one single, uniform set of rules. It was a living, breathing collection of diverse regional voices. There were 5 major regional dialects at play: Northern, East Midlands, West Midlands, Southern, and Kentish. If you traveled from the north down to Kent back then, you would hear vastly different pronunciations, you'd see entirely different spellings, and you'd even stumble across completely different local vocabulary. The language was intensely localized.
So how in the world did we get from 5 competing dialects to the standard English we actually recognize today? Well, while the other regional dialects stayed super localized and diverse, the East Midlands dialect gained a massive upper hand. Why? Because it was the dialect spoken in London. As London blew up into the ultimate cultural, political, and economic center of England, its voice naturally became the dominant voice. Plus, it was the exact dialect adopted by incredibly influential writers, most famously, Geoffrey Chaucer. So by being the voice of the capital and the language of popular literature, the East Midlands dialect won the linguistic battle and became the rock-solid foundation for standard English.
And that brings us to our final section, Bridge to Modern English, a literary triumph. Let's take a look at how this all builds into the vocabulary we use today. The foundation of Middle English managed to preserve its hearty, structural Germanic roots, which still makes up roughly 34% of the language, but it successfully integrated that French elegance at 33% and the Latin scholarship at another 33%. To put that into perspective, this exact combination, this perfect historical accident of blending these 3 specific linguistic streams, it created one of the richest, most expansive vocabularies in the entire world. It's like a giant linguistic puzzle coming together perfectly.
Which makes this quote so incredibly powerful. Middle English transformed the speech of ordinary people into the language of great literature. I mean, think about that. It took a language that had literally been sidelined as just the speech of common peasants, enriched it with French precision and Latin intellect, and turned it into the ultimate tool for artistic expression. Without this chaotic period of Middle English, the literary masterpieces of the late medieval period, and eventually the iconic works of William Shakespeare, they would have looked entirely different. It was the absolute necessary bridge between the ancient and the modern worlds.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. The story absolutely did not end in 1500. English is still that exact same living, breathing, adapting organism today. We are constantly absorbing new tech terms, we're borrowing from global cultures, and we are completely reshaping our grammar on the internet. You are an active participant in this ongoing evolution right now. So I have to ask, what new words will we borrow, adapt, or invent next as our language continues to live and evolve today? Think about that the next time you send a text or write an email. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep your ears open to the history hidden in your everyday words. Welcome to this explainer. Okay, I want you to start by just visualizing a world lit only by golden candlelight. In this era, the entirety of ancient human knowledge, philosophy, science, poetry, it's incredibly fragile. It literally hangs by a thread. I mean, without active protection, it could be lost to history forever.
So today we're exploring the Middle English period and looking at exactly how the medieval church stepped into the role of the ultimate guardian of education and literature. Just think about that for a second. What if a single book took an entire year to make? In our modern age of, well, instant downloads and next-day delivery, it's almost impossible to comprehend, right? But back then, books were incredibly rare, precious objects. Every single word of knowledge had to be carefully, painstakingly copied by hand. The stakes were absolutely huge. If a text wasn't copied, it just vanished. Poof. Gone forever.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our agenda today covers 5 main areas. First, the center of medieval life. Second, scriptoriums. Third, the birth of universities. Fourth, drama and religious literature. And finally, the return of English.
Starting off with Section 1, the center of medieval life.
To really understand the literature and education of the Middle English period, and we're talking roughly 1066 to 1500 here, we have to look at this whole ecosystem. The church didn't just hold religious authority, it basically had a total monopoly on education, it completely shaped the legal system, and it even dictated the politics of really powerful kings. For ordinary people, faith wasn't just a Sunday thing, it was a total way of life. Villages were literally built geographically around the church walls. It was, without a doubt, the absolute heart of society.
Moving on to Section 2, Scriptoriums and Preserving Ancient Knowledge.
Now, what's really interesting here is that because the church controlled education for a largely unlettered public, the massive responsibility of guarding human knowledge fell to dedicated monks. This space, the scriptorium, well, it wasn't just an office. It was a highly sacred room within a monastery where scribes literally devoted their entire lives to prayer, study, and preserving books. Honestly, without these sort of survival bunkers of medieval Europe, countless ancient Greek, Roman, and early English texts would have vanished entirely into the dark. No question.
And the process itself was just staggering. Step 1 required hours upon hours of meticulous hand copying with a quill and ink. But they didn't just write, they were creating art. Step 2 took this to a whole new level by applying actual gold leaf to decorate the pages, so they were literally illuminating them as they caught the candlelight. And Step 3 finished the whole thing off with these incredibly vibrant color illustrations. It was a truly painstaking effort of pure devotion.
Let's look at Section 3, the birth of universities. Let's move along and see how this builds, because as society outgrew those isolated monastery walls, things shifted rapidly. Pre-12th century, monasteries are basically the sole libraries and centers of learning. But hit the late 12th century and boom, the University of Oxford is founded, sparking a massive educational explosion. Shortly after that, in the early 13th century, the University of Cambridge follows suit. This was an absolutely massive expansion of formal higher education in England.
But what were they actually studying once they got there? Well, students traveled from all over the place to dive into theology, philosophy, law, medicine, and Latin grammar. And the learning style? It was rigorous. It wasn't just sitting there silently reading. Lessons involved highly intense public debates and this really careful, meticulous interpretation of religious texts. And keep in mind, Latin remained the absolute, uncontested language of education here.
Which brings us to Section 4, Drama and Religious Literature.
So while the academic elite were off debating in Latin at Oxford, how did the church actually educate the unlettered masses, the everyday people who couldn't read those beautiful golden manuscripts? The answer is visceral storytelling. The medieval imagination was totally dominated by these massive heavy themes: faith, sin, salvation, and the very stark realities of heaven, hell, and human morality. To communicate all of this, popular writings took the form of spoken sermons and epic biblical stories.
So the crucial point is how this public education actually played out. You had 3 distinct types of plays. There were mystery plays, which acted out biblical stories. Then miracle plays, focusing on the miraculous lives of saints. And morality plays, which actually personified human nature itself to teach religious lessons. Now, this wasn't just simple entertainment. This visual education, happening right there in the village square, became the very foundation of English drama. It paved the way centuries before Shakespeare even existed.
And finally, Section 5, the return of English.
For centuries, we had this incredibly stark divide. On one hand, you have Latin, the exclusive, prestigious language of the university elite. On the other hand, Middle English, the everyday dialect of the street and the tavern. This stark divide is exactly the gap writers had to bridge if they truly wanted to reach the hearts of ordinary people. Producing religious works in Middle English was a total game changer. It finally brought literature out of the university ivory towers and straight into daily life.
As this everyday English took hold, the creative floodgates completely opened. The church's teachings inspired poets and storytellers to deeply explore really complex concepts, things like justice, forgiveness, and human nature itself. So, over time, the church actually transformed from merely being a vault that guarded ancient knowledge into a profound inspiration for brand new artistic expression.
Looking back, the legacy of this era is just incredible. The medieval church preserved thousands of ancient manuscripts right there in their scriptoriums. It established the early schools and those powerhouse universities of Oxford and Cambridge. It basically protected learning during some of history's most difficult, turbulent eras. And ultimately, it cultivated the exact environment needed for English literature to take root and really thrive.
And that thriving, fertile environment set the stage perfectly for one massive historical shift. A man who would take this newly respected Middle English language, completely absorb the moral themes and the storytelling traditions of his era, and transform the whole shebang into absolute genius. We are, of course, talking about the father of English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer.
Which leaves us with this final burning thought. If the church built that sturdy foundation by carefully saving the written word, how exactly did one man, Geoffrey Chaucer, use that foundation to change the English language forever? What stories did he tell that finally elevated English into the realm of truly great literature? Well, that is a fascinating chapter of history, and I really hope this explainer has left you eager to dive into his legendary works next. Thanks for learning with me today.
Welcome to this explainer. You know, some writers write great books, but others, the truly monumental figures in history, they literally create great languages. Today, we're diving into how one extraordinary poet took everyday English and transformed it into world-class literature. So, let's start with the ultimate question. Think about the literature you read today. When you pick up a novel or, I don't know, read a poem in English, you're participating in a tradition that had to start somewhere, right? So, who actually proved that English was a language worthy of great art? Well, the answer is Geoffrey Chaucer. Today, we universally celebrate him as the absolute father of English literature. He was this total visionary whose bold choices laid the groundwork for literally everyone, from William Shakespeare to the modern authors sitting on your bookshelf right now. But how exactly did an ordinary kid from medieval London actually pull this off? Section 1, The Changing Medieval World, a Time of Chaos. To really grasp his impact, we have to look at the incredibly fractured world he was born into. In 1337, the 100 Years' War with France kicks off. Just a few years later, in 1343, Chaucer is born right into the thick of this tension in London. And then, bam, 1347, the Black Death sweeps in, devastating Europe and wiping out millions. I mean, this was a profoundly dark, turbulent time to be alive. Yet, somehow, amidst all that massive devastation, society was shifting. Trade was booming. Cities were growing larger and way more complex. And here is the absolutely crucial part. The Middle English spoken by everyday people in those busy, noisy marketplaces, it was getting stronger and stronger with every single generation. Section 2, The Worldly Diplomat, a Life of Experience. You see, Chaucer wasn't just some poet locked away in a room scribbling verses. He started out as an ordinary boy, though he did get an excellent education, born to a prosperous London merchant family that was deep in the wine trade. But getting a gig serving as a page in the royal household of Prince Lionel, who was a son of King Edward III, well, that completely changed his trajectory. It gave him this unbelievable inside look into royal courtly culture. I mean, just look at this incredible list of careers. He wasn't just a poet. He was a soldier, a diplomat, a customs officer, a royal administrator, and even a member of parliament. These intense, incredibly diverse roles put him right in the middle of high-stakes politics. He interacted with people from absolutely all walks of life. He knew kings and he knew commoners. And unlike a lot of writers of his time who kind of just stayed close to home, his diplomatic missions sent him all over. His extensive travels to France, Italy, and right across Europe exposed him to radical new ideas, languages, and cultures. It was a profound intellectual awakening, and it would completely shape the future of English literature. Section 3, Early Literary Masterpieces, Italian Influences. His earlier masterpieces run completely parallel to the heavy influence of the Italian masters he encountered while traveling. Works like the Book of the Duchess, The House of Fame, and The Parliament of Fowls were deeply, deeply inspired by literary giants like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. He was literally learning from the very best in the world. But he didn't just copy the Italians. No, he took these grand European literary techniques and just seamlessly merged them with English storytelling, creating something entirely new. He adapted their sophistication into his own native context. It was this extraordinary alchemy, two completely different cultures beautifully blending into one. Section 4. The English Language Revolution. Choosing English. Now, the medieval era was starkly divided. Serious literature, that was entirely dominated by Latin and French, the languages of royalty and the church elite. English was considered, well, far too vulgar for great works. But instead of just pandering to the elite establishment, Chaucer deliberately chose Middle English. It was a true game changer. He gave a profound voice to ordinary people, capturing real human emotion, humor, ambition, and faith. And this paradigm-shifting choice led directly to his ultimate masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales. This monumental work meant that readers from completely different social classes could finally enjoy brilliant, complex literature in their own language. He proved once and for all that English could be just as powerful, just as poetic as French or Latin. Section 5. An Immortal Legacy. Father of English. In the year 1400, Geoffrey Chaucer passed away. But while his life ended right there at the dawn of the 15th century, his legacy? It was honestly only just taking root. He was honored as the very first writer to be buried in what we now famously know as Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. By taking that sacred spot, he literally paved the way for Britain's greatest writers to follow him, establishing a permanent physical monument to English literature. So what's the ultimate takeaway here? It's simple, really. His genius gave a voice to ordinary people and elevated Middle English into the language of great poetry. Without his incredibly bold choices, the English literature we study, analyze, and absolutely love today simply might never have developed the way it did. He proved that the language of the streets could, in fact, become the language of the world. So, now that you understand the revolutionary architect behind the language itself, are you ready to meet the unforgettable pilgrims of the Canterbury Tales? The stage is set, the language has been forged, and these incredible stories are waiting for you. Thanks for exploring the foundations of English with me in this explainer, and definitely keep that curiosity alive.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking a trip back in time to explore an absolute masterpiece. I'm talking about Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. This is a collection that quite literally transformed English literature forever. So, let's dive right in.
A brave knight, a loud drunk miller, a 5-time widow, and a crooked pardoner walk into an inn. I mean, come on, that sounds exactly like the setup to a joke, doesn't it? But imagine this wildly diverse group of complete strangers. They're all traveling together on this long journey, and they decide to pass the time by just telling stories. Some of these are laugh-out-loud funny, some are deeply tragic, and others are these really sharp, biting critiques of the world around them.
And that brings us to a really fascinating question. What actually happens when ordinary people take over the story? You see, before this point in history, literature was almost exclusively reserved for epic heroes, saints, or really powerful kings. But as we'll see today, handing the microphone over to the everyday person completely revolutionized the literary landscape.
So, here is our itinerary for today. We'll start with the 14th century upheaval, follow the road to Canterbury, meet the pilgrims, unpack the framed narrative, and finally wrap up with the literary revolution that followed.
Starting with Part 1, 14th Century Upheaval, A Changing World.
To really grasp this masterpiece, you've got to picture the absolute chaos of England at the time. Back in 1170, you had the shocking murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket. Fast forward to the mid-1300s, and the Black Death rolls through, just devastating the population. But then, by the late 1300s, the surviving population sees this huge expansion in trade and a newly rising middle class. The church is still incredibly powerful, sure, but it's facing a lot of growing criticism. So what did this mean on the ground? It meant that people from vastly different social classes were suddenly interacting and rubbing shoulders way more than ever before in English history.
And because of these massive societal shifts, Chaucer made a totally radical choice. Instead of kings and heroes, he chose ordinary people. He wanted to create a literary work that held a mirror up to every single level of medieval society. He made everyday, flawed, fascinating people the actual center of his masterpiece.
Let's move to Part 2, The Road to Canterbury, A Holy Destination. Now we know a pilgrimage is a religious journey, but in medieval England, Canterbury was the ultimate destination. Pilgrims would travel for days just to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Yes, the very same archbishop who was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral back in 1170. People genuinely believed that praying at his shrine could bring physical healing, divine forgiveness, and spiritual blessings. By using this incredibly common, familiar journey, Chaucer provided the absolute perfect backdrop to throw a bunch of totally different characters together on the same dusty road.
Part 3. Meet the Pilgrims, the Tabard Inn.
So zoom in with me on a tavern in Southwark, just outside London. 29 pilgrims gather there to prep for their journey. And the innkeeper, a guy named Harry Bailey, comes up with a competition. He basically says, look, we have a really long trip ahead of us. Let's pass the time by telling stories. Whoever tells the best story gets a free dinner when we get back. And everyone agrees. It's such a beautifully simple idea, but it successfully sets up the entire framework for everything that follows.
120. Just think about that number for a second. That was Chaucer's massive original ambition for this storytelling contest. He envisioned every single one of the pilgrims telling multiple tales on the way to Canterbury and then more on the way back. It was going to be an absolutely gigantic undertaking.
But contrast that grand plan with reality. 24. That is the number of tales Chaucer actually managed to complete before his death. Yet, despite only finishing a fraction of his original plan, those 24 stories were so richly detailed and so groundbreaking that the unfinished collection still became an undisputed, timeless masterpiece.
Just look at this lineup. Through these characters, Chaucer captures a complete, unvarnished cross-section of England. You've got the knight representing the nobility. He is honorable, brave, and heavily respected. Then you have the wife of Bath. She's an incredibly independent woman for her time, wildly confident and outspoken. Contrast them with someone like the miller, a peasant who is loud, rude, and brings all the crude humor. And finally, someone like the pardoner, representing the church, who is undeniably clever but deeply, deeply dishonest. Through these specific, unforgettable personalities, Chaucer isn't just writing characters, he is basically archiving the entire social hierarchy and human nature of his era.
Moving to Part 4, the frame narrative, a story within a story.
Let's peek under the hood at the literary mechanics here. This nested structure unfolds in 3 steps. Step 1 is the main pilgrimage storyline. That's the outer frame of all these strangers traveling together on the road. Step 2 happens when it's a specific pilgrim's turn to speak up and entertain the group. And then Step 3 is the inner story they actually tell. The brilliance of this, the inner tale, whether it's romantic, comic, or a moral lesson, directly reflects the personality, the beliefs, and the social status of whoever is talking. I mean, the miller's tale is going to sound vastly different and be way more inappropriate than the knight's tale.
Unlike traditional epics that focused really narrowly on just a single hero or a king, a frame narrative allows for a rich, completely unprecedented variety of voices. It lets the author blend pure entertainment with some really biting social criticism, just by switching which character is holding the floor. And this variety is exactly what made the Canterbury Tales one of the absolute richest literary works ever produced in the English language.
Finally, Part 5, a literary revolution, changing the rules.
Zooming out to look at his lasting legacy, perhaps Chaucer's most revolutionary act was the language itself. He wrote in Middle English. Now, at the time, serious literature was usually written in Latin or French. But by abandoning those upper-class languages for Middle English, which was the language actually spoken by the common people on the streets, he made literature accessible to a much wider audience. He effectively validated the English language as a vehicle for high art. That's a real game changer.
So, to summarize why this text remains a masterpiece today, Chaucer celebrated ordinary people. He seamlessly mixed laugh-out-loud humor with profound wisdom. He blended gritty reality with soaring imagination, and he tied pure entertainment together with sharp social criticism. Because of all this, he essentially founded realistic storytelling in English. The Canterbury Tales is far more than just a collection of stories. It's a vivid, breathing portrait of medieval human experiences, packed with ideas that are just as relevant to us today.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. If you were sitting at the Tabard Inn today, sharing a drink before a long journey, which of these timeless characters would you want to hear a story from? Would you want the noble romance of the knight or the outspoken confidence of the wife of Bath? Keep that in mind, because in our next explainer, we are going to dive right into those specific famous tales to discover their deeper meanings. Thanks for exploring Middle English with me today.
Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're strapping in for a journey back in time, straight into the heart of the Middle English period. We're exploring the timeless brilliance of Geoffrey Chaucer's medieval masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales. And hey, we're not just talking about dusty old manuscripts today, we're diving into vibrant, animated stories that capture the absolute essence of what it means to be human. So, whether you're a longtime literature buff or just someone who loves a truly great story, you're definitely going to find something fascinating here today.
So what makes a story truly timeless? It's a massive question, isn't it? Why on earth are we still talking about a book written over 600 years ago? Do stories endure because they sweep us off our feet with some grand romance? Do they last because they make us laugh until our sides hurt? Or is it because they give us the unfiltered and honestly sometimes uncomfortable truth about human nature? Well, Chaucer somehow managed to do all three, and we're going to use this explainer to show you exactly how he pulled it off.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. The Knight's Noble Romance. 2. The Miller's Comic Deception. 3. The Wife of Bath's Wisdom. 4. The Pardoner's Deadly Greed. And finally, 5. Chaucer's Human Tapestry.
Let's jump into Section 1, The Knight's Noble Romance. Okay, so we're starting right at the very top of medieval society with our first storyteller, the knight. And the setup here is the ultimate medieval drama. Picture this. Two cousins, Palamon and Arcite, are prisoners of war locked away in a tower. One day, they look out the window and spot the beautiful Emily walking in a nearby garden. Instantly, both of them fall madly in love with her. I mean, their lifelong friendship immediately shatters and turns into this bitter and tense rivalry. Eventually, they get freed and are allowed to compete in a massive grand tournament to win Emily's hand in marriage. Arcite actually ends up winning the battle, but in a tragic twist of fate, he's fatally injured in a freak accident right after his victory. With his dying breath, he asks Emily to marry Palamon. It's this sweeping epic of destiny, love, and ultimate reconciliation. Now you can really see how the knight projects his own idealized worldview into this story. The core themes here are courtly love, chivalry, fate, honor, and friendship. He's a soldier, right? So he values these high ideals above absolutely everything else. He believes in a world governed by fate and noble actions. So this story isn't just a romance, it's a direct reflection of the lofty, sometimes rigid ideals of the medieval aristocracy.
Moving right along to Section 2, The Miller's Comic Deception.
Chaucer does not let us stay in that high-minded, idealized world for very long. He gives us intentional, absolute whiplash here. We just had The Knight's Tale, with its noble heroes, serious romance, and high society. But now, the Miller steps up and drops us right into the muddy, chaotic reality of everyday village life. The Miller is basically trolling the knight's serious romance by giving us a story about love that is incredibly inappropriate and just completely ridiculous.
The setup is practically a classic sitcom trap. We have John, an older, gullible carpenter, his wild, much younger wife, Allison, and a very clever student boarder named Nicholas, who wants Allison all to himself. To get the husband out of the way, Nicholas and Allison hatch this elaborate, hilarious deception. They somehow convince old John that a second great flood, literally like Noah's Ark, is coming to wipe out the world. They actually get this poor guy to sleep in a bathtub hanging from the ceiling just to prepare for it. The trick works perfectly at first, but it sets off a wild chain reaction of unexpected, disastrous events involving another jealous lover named Absalom. It all crashes together to create one of the absolute funniest, most chaotic endings in all of medieval literature.
So, while the knight was busy showing us how people should act, the Miller is here exposing how people actually act. Through comedy, deception, jealousy, irony, and human folly, he uses brilliant humor to highlight the foolishness of everyday people. It's a great reminder that humanity isn't just made up of noble knights, it's also full of tricksters and fools making terrible decisions.
All right, let's look at Section 3, The Wife of Bath's Wisdom.
Now we get to meet one of the most famous, striking, and unapologetic characters in literary history. This is a woman who openly challenged the deeply entrenched traditions of her time. In her tale, a knight of King Arthur's court commits a terrible crime. By law, he should be put to death. But the queen steps in and offers him a deal. He can save his own life, but only if he travels the world and returns in exactly 1 year with the correct answer to one impossible question: what do women desire most? If you put yourself in this knight's shoes, you can feel the absolute panic. He asks everywhere, but every single person gives him a different answer. Money, beauty, clothes, flattery. He is entirely out of luck until he meets an old woman. She agrees to give him the correct answer, but there's a catch. He has to promise to grant her next request, whatever it is. The knight returns to the court on the final day and delivers this climactic realization. Women desire sovereignty over their own lives and choices. Boom! He survives. But then, the old woman steps up and demands that he marry her. He is horrified, but he's forced to keep his promise. On their wedding night, she gives him a choice regarding her appearance and loyalty. And because he has finally learned his lesson, he tells her to choose for herself. He actually gives her the sovereignty she asked for. Because he respects her choice, she transforms into a beautiful and faithful wife, and they live happily ever after. I really want you to take a moment to process how incredibly progressive this is. The themes of women's authority, marriage, equality, wisdom, and transformation make The Wife of Bath a strikingly modern voice speaking to us from a 600-year-old text. Through her tale, she's actively advocating for mutual respect and equality in marriage. She's arguing that true happiness can only happen when power is shared, rather than held by just one person. It is an absolute masterclass in challenging societal norms.
Which brings us to Section 4, the partner's deadly greed.
From a tale of wisdom and transformation, we now descend into some very dark, dangerous psychological territory. This is the most famous moral tale of the entire collection. The partner tells the story of three young men, rioters really, who are arrogant enough to think they can hunt down and literally kill death. An old man points them toward a dark forest, telling them they'll find death under a specific tree. But when they get there, they don't find a monster or the Grim Reaper. They find a massive pile of gold coins. Instantly, all that friendship just evaporates. They send the youngest into town for wine to celebrate. But while he's gone, the other two plot to stab him and split the gold two ways. Meanwhile, the youngest guy buys poison and spikes the wine, plotting to kill the other two so he can keep the whole stash for himself. When he gets back, the sequence is brutally fast. The two stab him to death, then they sit down to drink the poison wine to celebrate, and they die too. They went looking for death, and they absolutely found it. The moral here is hauntingly clear. Greed destroys everyone. And the incredible tragic irony of the story is that at the end of it all, the three men are dead, and that massive pile of gold just sits there under the tree, completely untouched. The partner uses this terrifying tale to preach against the love of money.
But there's a fascinating layer of irony here, regarding these themes of greed, death, betrayal, morality, and human weakness. You see, the partner himself is notoriously greedy. He literally tells this brilliant moral story warning against greed solely to guilt his listeners into giving him their money. It's a wildly fascinating look at human hypocrisy, showing us how quickly supposed virtues can devolve into fatal betrayal.
Finally, Section 5, Chaucer's Human Tapestry.
Let's pull all of these threads together to see why this anthology stands today as an absolute masterclass in literary realism. Just look at the breakdown. The Knight gives us noble romance, reflecting the ideals of chivalry. The Miller offers comic deception, reflecting everyday human folly. The Wife of Bath mirrors shifting gender dynamics with her progressive wisdom, and the Partner exposes hypocrisy and greed through a lens of dark morality. Chaucer didn't just write stories, he built full psychological profiles. Each tale acts as a mirror to the specific personality, social class, and worldview of the person telling it. Instead of giving us perfect, boring heroes, he gave us real, flawed, incredibly complex human beings.
And that brings us to a final, profound thought. 600 years later, which of these characters do we still see in our world today? Well, the truth is, we see all of them. We still see people clinging to noble ideals, pranksters making terrible choices, courageous individuals fighting for equality, and sadly, the destructive power of greed. That is the true genius of Chaucer's human tapestry. The clothes and the settings might be medieval, but the human heart, it hasn't changed a bit. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the stories that define us.
You know, whenever we think about the Middle English period, there's always one monumental name that immediately pops into our heads, right? Geoffrey Chaucer. But here's the thing. While he definitely gets most of the spotlight, he was absolutely not acting alone. Behind him stood this incredibly vibrant ecosystem of brilliant writers who were actively shaping ancient British society, culture, and religion. Welcome to this explainer. Today, as you'll see through some of these amazing animated scenes of medieval history we've got for you, we're looking way past the author of the Canterbury Tales. We're going to discover the visionary poets and thinkers who literally laid the true foundation for the English language. Let's dive in.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with beyond Geoffrey Chaucer, Then look at morality and religious reform, visions of divine love, legends of the Round Table, the anonymous romance master, and finally, wrap up with the literary foundation.
Section 1. Beyond Geoffrey Chaucer. To really wrap our heads around ancient British culture, we have to recognize that long before Shakespeare ever picked up a quill, a wildly diverse cast of medieval writers was already out there boldly dissecting religion, exposing systemic corruption, setting the rules for high romance, and questioning the very nature of the human soul.
Section 2. Morality and religious reform. To see exactly how this played out, let's mentally step right into the muddy, backbreaking agricultural fields of medieval England. It's here that we meet William Langland, a fierce critic of the rampant corruption within the medieval church and the super-rigid class structures of his day.
Now, if you take a look at the text on screen, this is Langland's defining masterpiece, Piers Plowman. It's an allegorical dream vision. Basically, it follows a dreamer, appropriately named Will, who is just desperately searching for truth. As Will journeys through this vividly animated dreamscape of British society, he bumps into all sorts of symbolic characters. We're talking figures that represent the absolute best of human virtues and, of course, some devastatingly dark vices.
And this really hits the nail on the head regarding what Langland was truly fighting for. As you can see, his major themes were religious reform, social justice, morality, truth, and faith. He believed with absolute certainty that honesty and hard work were just infinitely more important than the hoarded wealth of the church. And you know, it's pretty incredible when you think about it. His relentless fight against systemic corruption, it actually mirrors a lot of the contemporary fights for social justice we're scrolling past on our news feeds today.
All right, let's step away from the muddy fields and walk right through the gilded doors of the royal courts. Meet John Gower. He wrote this massive ethical work called Confessio Amantis, which translates to The Lover's Confession. This thing is a staggering achievement. It's packed with over 100 moral stories that use storytelling to explore big ideas like love, justice, wisdom, and human responsibility.
Now take a look at this breakdown, because Gower's versatility was just off the charts. He didn't just write in English. He wrote masterfully in 3 distinct languages. He used Latin for academic and theological reach, French for that courtly romance and prestige, and English for giving direct moral instruction to the common folks. He had this amazing ability to seamlessly combine the entertainment value of romance with unyielding ethical lessons. It's really no wonder he earned the title of England's moral poet.
Section 3. Visions of divine love. Let's step away from the bustling courts for a moment and enter the quiet, candlelit mysticism of a medieval chapel. This brings us to Julian of Norwich. She represents one of the most extraordinary, highly empathetic voices of medieval England. Plus, she holds the incredibly important distinction of being the very first known woman to ever write a book in the English language.
The absolutely crucial thing to understand here is just how radical Julian was for her time. Look at this comparison. Typical medieval religion was heavily centered around fear, doom, and strict divine punishment. But Julian? After surviving a near-fatal illness, she documented a series of intense mystical visions in her book, Revelations of Divine Love. She completely shifted the religious focus away from all that fear and doom, redirecting it entirely toward hope, mercy, and a profound sense of divine compassion.
Just read this quote. "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Wow. I mean, in an era that was literally plagued by disease, war, and constant religious terror, these deeply comforting words were nothing short of revolutionary. It's exactly why her mystical visions still hold up today as some of the greatest, most enduring spiritual works ever written in the English language.
Section 4. Legends of the Round Table. All right, let's shift gears again and head out into the clash of steel and the thundering hooves of the chivalric battlefields. As the Middle English period drew to a close, a guy named Sir Thomas Malory took it upon himself to preserve the grandest, absolute bloodiest legends of ancient Britain. I'm talking, of course, about Camelot.
Now, what's really fascinating about this text, Le Morte d'Arthur, is the sheer monumental scale of it. It's not just a single story, it's a massive epic compilation. Malory literally gathered up all the scattered, disjointed legends of King Arthur, the wizard Merlin, Queen Guinevere, Sir Lancelot, and the Holy Grail, and he painstakingly wove the whole shebang together into one cohesive, sweeping masterpiece of English prose. And through these core themes of chivalry, honor, loyalty, heroism, and tragedy, Malory essentially handed us a blueprint. Seriously, think about the epic fantasy films, the sprawling television shows, and those thick fantasy novels sitting on your shelves right now. Mallory's compilation is the exact engine driving modern fantasy. Pretty much every knight in shining armor you see on a screen today owes a huge debt to Sir Thomas Malory.
Section 5. The Anonymous Romance Master. Let's leave the bright battlefields of Camelot behind and venture into the supernatural, shadowy, untamed forests of medieval England. Out here, we find one of the greatest, yet completely unnamed, writers of the entire era. Scholars just call him the Pearl Poet. To this day, his true identity remains one of the most compelling mysteries in all of literature.
We literally only know about this absolute genius because of the incredible literary output he left behind. Look at these titles: Pearl, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Patience and Cleanness. These are deeply symbolic, masterful works of art. Honestly, to have written just one of these would guarantee you a place in history books. But this anonymous author gave us 4 distinct masterpieces.
And his most famous work, without a doubt, is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's widely considered to be one of the greatest romances in all of English literature, but actually, scratch that. It's not exactly a romance in the modern sense at all. It's this gripping, heroic duel that mashes up supernatural mystery and intense moral temptation. Basically, Gawain has to face down this massive, terrifying green warrior in a lethal and frankly bizarre game of beheading. It's wild.
Finally, Section 6, the Literary Foundation. Let's take a step back and look at the really big picture here. When we bring all these wildly different voices together, the social reformer, the trilingual moralist, the female mystic, the preserver of legends, and that anonymous master of suspense, we see something truly incredible. This wasn't just a period of isolated scribblers working in the dark. It was a collective, unstoppable force that took English from a common vernacular and transformed it into a globally dominant literary language.
You can clearly see how this momentum builds on our timeline here. In the 1300s, Langland gives us justice, Gower gives us ethics, and Julian gives us hope. Then, rolling into the 1400s, Malory gives us heroism and tragedy. So when literary giants like William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, and John Milton arrive on the scene in the 1500s and beyond, they weren't building their castles in the sky. Not at all. They built them directly upon the unbreakable foundation laid by the writers we've been exploring today.
So, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought to chew on. How do the ancient themes of morality, tragedy, and romance from these medieval writers still shape the media you consume today? I really challenge you to look closely at your favorite movies, books, and shows this week and see if you can spot that medieval DNA hiding right there in modern storytelling. This era was incredibly rich, and trust me, we are far from done exploring it. In our next explainer, we're going to uncover the major literary forms of the era, diving headfirst into the fascinating world of mystery and morality plays. You definitely won't want to miss it. Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so between the years 1066 and 1500, literature underwent a massive transformation. I mean, it literally shifted from being this exclusive thing written just for kings and lords into something for absolutely everyone. Suddenly, literature actually started to reflect the beliefs, the everyday struggles, and the grand dreams of ordinary people. We're going to dive in and see exactly how these ancient literary forms evolved and really laid the groundwork for the kinds of stories you and I still consume today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our mental roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. A new age of stories. 2. Chivalry and heroic quests. 3. Ballads of the people. 4. Dreams and spiritual symbols. And finally, 5. The rise of medieval drama. Basically, we'll see how the story moves from elite courts to village squares, right into the mind, and then out onto the public stage.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, A New Age of Stories.
To really grasp this, we have to look at the timeline. This era was arguably one of the most highly creative periods in all of English history. We're talking about a vast 4-century sweep here, from 1066 all the way to the transition into the Renaissance in 1500. Over this time, entirely new literary ideas took root. Storytelling became significantly more adventurous, blending real history with wild myth. Poetry became incredibly symbolic. These 4 centuries are essentially the crucible that set the foundation for modern storytelling and forged the forms that would later inspire giants like Shakespeare.
Moving right along to Section 2, Chivalry and Heroic Quests. I want you to picture the grand, candlelit halls of the medieval elite. This is where our first major literary form was born. Now, what's really interesting about this contrast is how we use the word romance.
Today, it immediately brings to mind love stories, right? Rom-coms and relationship dramas. But medieval romance? Completely different beast. It focused heavily on high-stakes adventure, strict codes of chivalry, immense courage, and heroic quests. Basically, if you want to understand medieval romance, don't think of a romantic comedy. Think of today's superhero movies or epic fantasy blockbusters.
And this era gave us absolute heavyweights of the genre. I'm talking about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Le Morte d'Arthur, and the sprawling Arthurian legends. When you read these, it's like you can almost hear the clash of steel swords and sense that deep, mystical magic of Camelot. These were stories of brave knights facing incredibly dangerous challenges, venturing out into dark medieval forests and, sometimes even battling dragons. And it was all to protect their kingdoms and prove their absolute loyalty and honor.
Next up, Section 3, Ballads of the People.
So we're leaving those wealthy royal courts behind now, and we're shifting the atmosphere down into the dirt and cobblestone of rustic village squares. Out here, traveling minstrels entertain the masses with ballads. A ballad is essentially a narrative poem that was meant to be sung or recited out loud, and the key thing to remember is that these spread entirely through oral tradition long before anyone ever put a pen to parchment. You can really think of the ballad as the medieval news and entertainment network for ordinary people who obviously didn't have access to grand castle libraries. Now, these ballads were incredibly effective, and they relied on a distinct, driving musical rhythm and heavy repetition. By using snappy dialogue and very simple language, an ordinary commoner could easily remember them. They'd pass down these complex, dramatic tales of love, epic war, heroic deeds, and devastating family tragedies, generation after generation.
Let's move to Section 4, Dreams and Spiritual Symbols, and see how this builds.
Okay, transitioning away from those lively public squares, we're now heading straight into the inward, deeply spiritual mind of the medieval reader. Writers back then were absolutely obsessed with symbolism, and this gave rise to the allegory, which is a story where characters and events directly represent deeper moral or spiritual ideas. Writers used this framework, famously seen in William Langland's masterpiece Piers Plowman, because, it allowed them a really safe, highly imaginative way to discuss complex human nature and strict medieval morality without directly pointing fingers at real people in power. To pull this off, they often used a brilliant, quite literal formula called the dream vision. It follows a distinct three-step progression. Step 1, the narrator literally falls asleep. Simple enough, right? Step 2, they enter a highly symbolic dream world, maybe a mystical forest or some heavenly landscape. And then Step 3, through the events of that dream, they discover a profound spiritual or moral truth. This exact formula drives iconic medieval works like Pearl, The House of Fame, and of course Piers Plowman.
Finally, we land at Section 5, The Rise of Medieval Drama.
Having explored the inner mind, we're bringing the audience back out into the bustling town square, where literature actually becomes an interactive tool for mass public education. And this brilliantly illustrates a crucial difference in early staged events. The first English plays were basically staged by the church. You had mystery plays, which took iconic biblical stories like Noah's Ark and brought them to life visually. Then, on the other hand, you had miracle plays, which focused entirely on the lives and miracles of saints. Both types were staged during massive religious festivals to attract huge crowds, and they made dense religious teachings super visual and easy for the common person to grasp.
But as we moved into the late Middle Ages, drama became even more abstract and symbolic. This gave us the morality play. Instead of casting historical or biblical figures, writers started putting costumes on literal concepts. Imagine actors walking onto a stage playing the personification of greed, pride, good deeds, or even death. You can really frame these plays as highly interactive public sermons. The late Middle Ages were incredibly symbolic, and the explicit goal of these plays was to save souls by holding a mirror right up to human nature.
The absolute most famous example of this is a morality play called Everyman. The main character, literally representing all human beings facing their end, is approached by death. And it's here that every man learns a harsh truth. Only your good deeds will accompany you into the afterlife. It's a simple, undeniably powerful core message. It taught audiences that a virtuous life held infinitely more value than worldly wealth or power.
So, the crucial point is this. While the actual formats changed, from grand romances to village ballads to stage plays, the core obsessions of the people remained remarkably consistent. We constantly see recurring themes of love and heroism, chivalry and faith. The tension between justice and greed, deep dives into morality and human nature, questions of destiny, and some pretty sharp social criticism. These exact themes reflected the hopes and fears of medieval society, and more importantly, they prepared the cultural soil for the explosive creativity of the Renaissance.
We've seen how Middle English literature took storytelling on a monumental journey, from the exclusive royal court, out into the muddy streets of the commoner, and deep into the spiritual soul. But here's the thing. These ancient literary forms haven't disappeared. They've really just changed their clothes. So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought today. As you watch movies, read books, or binge your favorite shows this week, which of these ancient medieval themes are still quietly driving your favorite stories today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep looking for the history hidden in the stories all around you.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer and discover how the era between 1066 and 1500 basically handed us the keys to modern English storytelling. You know, every great civilization leaves behind a legacy, but the legacy of medieval England is particularly special because it literally gave us the words we are using right now. This wasn't just a time of knights and castles. It was a period of incredible political change, social upheaval, and cultural rebirth that completely rewired how humans communicate. So here's our roadmap for today. 1. Transforming the English language. 2. Literature for the people. 3. New storytelling traditions. 4. The printing press revolution. And 5. Fueling the English Renaissance. To give us some context on the timeline, we're looking at how this specific medieval era served as the vital bridge between ancient, localized languages and global literature, starting right at 1066 with the Norman Conquest, forcefully injecting French and Latin into the English lexicon. Then we'll march all the way to 1476, which brought an absolute technological marvel to England, mark the close of the period around 1500, and look post-1500 at the dawn of the English Renaissance. It is essentially a massive, centuries-long domino effect. Okay, part 1. Transforming the English language, from conquered to conqueror. Think about this for a second. Before Middle English, if you wanted to read an important book or even understand a royal decree, you had to know French or Latin. The written word was literally locked behind an educational paywall. It was easily accessed only by scholars and high-ranking nobles. But jump to the end of the 15th century, and Old English hadn't just survived. It completely adapted. It absorbed thousands of those fancy elite French and Latin words, the grammar actually got simpler, and boom, it stepped out of the shadows to become the primary national language of everyday communication. It went straight from the language of the conquered peasants to the language of the entire nation. And as the language shifted to belong to everyone, the audience shifted too. Which brings us to part 2. Literature for the people. Democratizing the written word. This was a massive cultural turning point. Suddenly, knights are standing right beside merchants in these stories, and farmers are standing beside priests. Visionaries like Geoffrey Chaucer basically flipped the entire literary script. Instead of writing in elite Latin to, impress a handful of scholars, they started writing in the raw, vibrant English that ordinary people were speaking in the markets and taverns. Think about how revolutionary that is. For the very first time, readers could actually look at a page and see a true mirror of their own society. Literature was absolutely no longer just for the top 1%. So, this inclusive, democratic new spirit required a brand new way to tell stories to match its audience. That's part 3, New Storytelling Traditions, the Roots of Modern Fiction. Enter literary realism. This is the literal medieval DNA that created those deeply flawed, authentic characters you probably binge watch on television today. Before this, stories were usually about perfect, untouchable saints or mythological heroes who never ever made a mistake. But Middle English writers, they started portraying real human beings. They gave us characters who made terrible decisions, who had a great sense of humor, who were petty, ambitious, and afraid. They wrote about humanity exactly as it actually is, not as it ideally should be. Chaucer gave us some of the absolute best examples of this, proving that realism was completely taking over English literature. If you've ever read the Canterbury Tales, you know exactly who these people are. You've got the wife of Bath, right? Just bold and completely unapologetic about her views on marriage. The partner, who's this greedy, hypocritical church official. And the miller, who's loud, drunk, and tells completely inappropriate jokes. These weren't idealized statues, they were totally authentic. Honestly, they felt like people you could bump into on the street today. And because literature was finally for everyone, we saw an absolute explosion of new literary forms emerge to entertain and educate them. You had mystery, miracle, and morality plays bringing stories out of the church and straight into the streets for public theater. You had romances packed with knights and grand adventures. You had ballads acting like musical time capsules for people who couldn't read, preserving history through song, and even dream vision poems exploring complex philosophy and spirituality. It was, without a doubt, a golden age of creative experimentation. Now, to really change the world, these amazing new stories needed a way to scale beyond handwritten manuscripts. Part 4, The Printing Press Revolution, Scaling the Story. So, ask yourself, without modern technology, how on earth could Chaucer's relatable characters actually reach a wider audience across the country? Up until this point, if you wanted a book, a scribe literally had to sit at a desk with a quill and meticulously copy every single letter by hand over the course of months. So, how does a democratic literature actually get into the hands of the wider public under those incredibly slow conditions? Well, the answer lies in one very specific year. 1476. That is when a guy named William Caxton changed the game completely by introducing the printing press to England. And guys, it is almost impossible to overstate what a massive paradigm shift this was for the spread of human knowledge. Caxton's printing press wasn't just about printing books faster. Though, obviously, going from books taking months to copy by hand to being produced rapidly was huge for spreading knowledge across regions. But the real secret ingredient here? It moved English towards standardization. Think about it. Before 1476, depending on what town you lived in, you might spell a word completely differently than someone living just one town over. The spelling was highly variable. But the printing press locked the language down. Because identical copies were suddenly shipping all over the country, English was basically forced to standardize its spelling and writing. And this newly standardized, mass-distributed language perfectly sets the stage for our final act. Part 5. Fueling the English Renaissance, the ultimate payoff. It's absolutely vital to understand that the heavy hitters, William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, Christopher Marlowe, Sir Philip Sidney, and John Milton, they did not invent this rich, dramatic tradition from scratch. They were the inheritors. When these literary titans sat down to write their masterpieces in the Renaissance, they were handed a fully formed, incredibly rich, standardized language. The genres, the realistic character arcs, the dramatic frameworks, all of that heavy lifting had already been done by the medieval writers who came before them.
So it really is a beautifully simple reality. Every page of modern English literature carries the legacy of the Middle Ages. Without the initial pain of the conquest, without the genius of writers like Chaucer choosing to write for the common person, and without that massive technological leap of the printing press, the English language as a global literary powerhouse simply would not exist.
So, what medieval DNA is hiding in the book you're reading right now? Next time you read a novel or go watch a play, I want you to look for those beautifully flawed characters and just remember the centuries-long evolutionary journey that actually gave them a voice. Every sarcastic sidekick, every deeply conflicted hero, and literally every printed word you consume owes a massive debt to the Middle English period. Thanks so much for diving into this explainer with me today, and keep your eyes peeled for that medieval DNA hiding in plain sight.